Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the winter school. My name is Ayat Hamdan, a researcher at the ACRPS Center, and I am honored to introduce Professor Marc Caball as today's speaker. I am sure that most of you know him and know his work, but let me briefly introduce him before we move to his presentation. Marc Caball is an historian and associate professor in the School of History, University College Dublin. Professor Caball is also the lead investigator on the Irish Research Council funded project called Mapping Readers and Readership in Dublin, 1826 to 1926. His research interests center on early modern Ireland and the history of the early modern British Atlantic. His current research projects are focused on the cultures of communication and in early modern Ireland and the Tralee fascicle for the Royal Irish Academy's Irish Historic Town Atlas. So please join me in welcoming him and his presentation entitled of Sectarianism in Ireland, Historical Context. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. And again, my thanks to the ACRPS Center for enabling us to come together to discuss issues of sectarianism, but to do so in a comparative context. And certainly as somebody who comes from a different background, who is a non-Arabist, a European historian, it's been an extremely innovative and stimulating few days. So I think the organizers, when they invited me, the idea was that I would talk about another geographical zone, that I would look at another cultural zone, historical zone, political zone, social zone, where sectarianism has been influential and has to some extent colored notions of history and identity. Now, I'm very much aware that history has a tendency, like many other subjects in the humanities over the past 20 years with the rise of the PhD industry, to become much more microscopic in its focus. Okay, people tend to focus on very specific and very minute, in some cases, themes. And that's understandable in terms of getting the PhD, getting your foot on the professional ladder. You choose something, you choose a chewable bite size intellectually, and that's fully understandable. But I think with that intense professionalization has come a certain narrowing of horizons, intellectual horizons, and I think that we all need maybe to stand back and to look at what we're doing in a much more holistic way, to maybe sort of think of things within an intellectual or a cultural ecology. And in my thinking on this, I'm very influenced by, I suppose, the rise of global history over the past maybe 5-6 years. Initially, my training was that of a cultural historian, but maybe and people can be very critical of global history, that it means nothing and everything at the same time. But nonetheless, as we've experienced globalization over the past 20 years, it has drawn our attention, I think, to the intensity of connections that bind people, cultures, and religions together. National history, as we understand it, is very much a product of the European 19th century, with the rise of the nation state, when history had a function of legitimation, a function of validation. So you have the rise of specific schools, national schools, Danish history, Irish history, British history, and so on. And they, in their day, served both a cultural and a political objective, and to some extent we're still within that tradition, but it's useful from time to time, it seems to me, to look at our historical experience in a comparative context, be that regional, global history. So I wanted to talk about Ireland today, and I'm very conscious that yesterday's lecture from Morton looked at the whole notion of primordialist or instrumentalist approaches to sectarianism. So, you know, where do you begin and when do you begin to look at the phenomenon of sectarianism in any given particular context? I'm conscious that most of you won't know very much about Ireland, very little, understandably. So I just, today in my first lecture, want to put some historical context. Being an historian, I believe that history matters and that we actually need to look at a pedigree, a lineage, a seam, and how those seams come together and influence the people we are today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm conscious I don't want this to be a busman's tour of Irish history and sort of throwing facts at you. And with that in mind, what I want to do today is really to make an argument that in the case of Ireland, religion becomes an essential element of identity, of group identity, collective identity in the face of colonialism. But when I say colonialism, I need to be very careful in the Irish context because Ireland was never actually a colony, okay? It was a kingdom created by Henry VIII in 1541. Before that it was a lordship, 1800. It's an integral part of the United Kingdom, okay? Until the south of Ireland decided to succeed, or whatever you wish to call it, in 1922. So legally it's not a colony. It's very interesting. Legally it's not a colony. So when I use colonialism or neo-colonialism, I'm not being entirely accurate. So it contains, when we look at the Irish case, it contains a series of paradoxes that may resonate with your areas of study. But anyway, to put things in context, I mean, Ireland is a very small geographical zone. It's situated in the North Atlantic. Currently, there are 2 different jurisdictions, okay? The south of Ireland consists of 26 counties, and 6 counties in the north of Ireland are under are within British jurisdiction. There are about 4.8 million people in the Republic of Ireland and only 1.8 million in Northern Ireland. So you know, I was listening to the startling statistics for Nigeria yesterday, where you have this extraordinarily large population. The Irish case really would, by Nigerian standards, consist of a sort of a village case study, I suspect, in proportionate terms, all right? So we're going from, you know, from the Lilliputian to something that is quite micro. So it's on the edge of Europe, literally, and being on the edge of anywhere brings challenges, I think. You can either be very isolated, or you can position yourself to benefit from being on the edge. So Ireland's Christianity has traditionally been something has had a slightly different flavour. The original population was Celtic, and as you know, the Celtic languages and Celtic cultures have been driven to the edge of Europe, so it occupies that sort of Celtic sphere. English commentators call it rather patronisingly the Celtic fringe, right? I tend maybe to avoid being on the fringe. It doesn't sound like a good place to be, all right? So even in the use of language, you know, one has to be so terribly careful. My students often write about natives or settlers. I mean, who is the native or who is the settler? You have to be so extremely careful. I mean, you know, we talk about indigenous peoples. My students talk about the discovery of the New World. Well, it wasn't discovered. It was discovered by Europeans, but there were people there for quite a long time before the Europeans ever cast their gaze on the New World. So, in many ways, the New World is an old world. Anyway, to continue. So, bear in mind, I'm giving you a busman's tour, but the busman's tour of Irish history is with a view to trying to disentangle this bundle of identity and religion, and how religion becomes central to the expression of national identity in a neo or quasi-colonial context. Irish Christianity has always been slightly unusual. St. Patrick arrived around 432. The Irish had been worshipping heathen gods and goddesses, no doubt, like other Europeans before them. But they quickly absorbed Christianity and When Christianity is absorbed by indigenous people, they inflect it, they inform it with some of their own customs. So it's not simply a clean break with the past. And with the introduction of Christianity, you have the development of a literature in the Irish language. Irish is one of the oldest written European languages after Greek and Latin. So there's a large body of old literature. Being an island as it is, it's subject to occasional invasions. So the Vikings invade in the 9th century. They establish urban centres. There's another wave of invasion by Anglo-Norman invaders in 1169 who come from the neighbouring island of Britain. But people become assimilated. The Vikings become assimilated. They become Christianized. The Anglo-Normans come with a common faith. Okay, so this common European Christian faith that's to be found in Europe down to the eve of the Reformation actually acts as a kind of a unifying cultural zone. So from the far west of Ireland to Poland, you will have moved through a common religious zone. That's something we often forget about. People may not have understood the Mass. They may have walked around, conducted their business, sold a pig or a cow. The local church, the priest would have had his back to the congregation. Mass would have been in Latin. Latin is the language of a European elite, okay? One of the other things we need to get out of our heads too is the importance of English. I mean, English was the language of people who dealt in sheep's wool, right? Down to the sea. No offense, Simon, but you know, sheep's wool did make England wealthy. But we need to realize that you didn't need to know English in the 16th century if you were going anywhere important. But what you did need to know was Latin. So there are a number of cultural assumptions that impact on our thinking that I think we need to take out. Anyway, this common European zone of belief, of religiosity, of religious expression, Catholic, is suddenly and very fundamentally disrupted with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517. I'm not going to go into the history of the Reformation. But the history of the Reformation profoundly impacts on the Irish case, because simultaneously with Reformation comes a renewed interest on the part of the English administration in annexing Ireland much more closely within the ambit of London. And that's done by and inaugurated by the redoubtable Henry VIII. You see him there in all his splendor. And it's funny, isn't it, that Irish history should be so determined by a man who wished to secure a divorce. Consider the paradox. I mean, I love it. I mean, centuries of history, and history for England and the subsequent British Empire, are determined by a man who wished to get rid of his first wife, all right? Unfortunately, it is unfortunate, the Pope didn't play his game. So what do you do when you can't get the Pope to give you a divorce? You start your own church, okay? So Henry has himself declared head of the church in England. But this coincides with strengthening English confidence. You know, they're beginning to view the world. They're beginning to realize that they wish to expand. He has himself declared King of Ireland in 1541. So this introduces an explosive mix. It seems to me, and I use the word advisedly, when you mix religion and ethnicity in a conflict, you're probably guaranteed a pretty bumpy ride. I don't want to give you the history of English attempts to copper fasten, to tighten their control. But over the course of the 16th century, various attempts were made by the English authorities to bring Ireland under full control. One of the means of doing that was just to bring English settlers, English and Scottish settlers, and plant them, okay? Colonists in the literal sense. So that affects a change of demographic. You introduce a large number of English-speaking Protestants. In the face of this, the Irish became And I'm putting this very, very inelegantly and perhaps without a degree of subtlety which it requires. But they began to identify with Catholicism as a way of marking difference, as a way of taking an oppositional stance to what was happening. Right, I'm just going to, where am I there? Yeah, I could run ahead of myself. So, yeah, sorry, I'm on two different systems here. I can't read there, so I need mine here, and I'm on this. So I feel like I'm rather ineptly at the controls of a Boeing trying to land at Hamad International Airport. So it's okay, I'll get you down, don't worry. It just might be a little bit bumpy. So what you have in Ireland is the creation of two different religious systems from the 16th century onwards. You have a state church that nobody attends. All right, so you have this bizarre situation where in Dublin today, you've got two Protestant cathedrals. There is no Catholic cathedral, but it's an overall Catholic majority country. So you have this kind of make-believe system, right? You have a state church, which is a Protestant church. It's called the Church of Ireland. It's the sister church of the Church of England, and it remains the state church right down to the end of the 19th century. In a situation where the vast majority of the people are actually practicing Catholics. So you have the banishment of Catholic priests, and you have the creation of an alternative cultural, religious zone for the Irish on the continent. Irish intellectuals begin to migrate, Irish priests go to the continent, a whole chain of colleges for the Irish is established across the continent. One very famous college established by the Irish Franciscans at Louvain, Leuven, in 1607. You have Irish colleges in Rome, Paris, Prague, Salamanca, and so on. So while you have a state church which is spurned by the majority of people in Ireland, on the continent a parallel Catholic system is created. Again, as I say, I don't want to give you a busman's tour. It's too early to engage with the minutiae of Irish history. But there is a subtle change in the nature of the population. The English authorities introduce, through a system known as plantation, they introduce a large number of settlers. And this isn't a mere historical fact, because I'm afraid the afterlife of the introduction of large numbers of English and Scottish Protestants means that you have the creation of a large Protestant, of a substantial Protestant majority in the very north of Ireland, okay? And that, to some extent, is why we have sectarianism in one part of Ireland today. And this notion of, if you're Irish, you're Catholic, develops very strongly. For instance, the arrival of Oliver Cromwell, who had led basically a coup in Britain, in England, in the 1640s, which culminated with the execution of Charles I, a fairly radical act. You know, I say to my students, the English are a people of continuity, of tradition and conservatism. But when they decide to become radical, they become really radical, okay? So, as you think about it, a king is God's anointed on earth, okay? Commonly accepted European precept. To kill a king, to execute a king, as in the case of Charles I, is to go against God's divine plan. The execution of Charles ushers in a republic. Again, it's, you know, in today's world, it's very hard to imagine the English in a republic. Simon? I mean, it seems unnatural, right? Okay, you obviously want a Republic of Yorkshire, but, you know. At the time, an English republic in the guise of Oliver Cromwell. So Cromwell in an English context is somebody who's seen as a guarantor of liberties, as a guarantor of religious freedom. In the Irish case, it's quite different. He brought an army to Ireland, which was noted for its brutality and for a series of massacres. So what you're getting is you're developing this iconography of opposition. an iconography of racial oppositionalism. So the Irish evermore begin to identify with a strong sense of Catholicism. They're Irish Catholics who are being oppressed by English Protestants. And I think, those are the very beginnings of this long tradition of sectarianism, which has been so much a feature of Irish history down till quite recently. And it's the recent bit that becomes fascinating, because I would argue that sectarianism has disappeared effectively in the south of Ireland. And why? Given that it was such a deeply entrenched marker of identity. Why have people moved away from the Catholic Church in large numbers? Okay? And why has that not happened in the other part of Ireland, where church identity is still very important? But that's another story. So Cromwell is an episode which has gone down in the annals. Right. Just to take one episode maybe of how entrenched sectarianism is in Irish history, with the defeat of James II, an English Stuart king, we see the end of the House of Stuart in England and its replacement by William of Orange and James's daughter Mary. Okay, so that really solidifies the Protestant notion of Britishness. We are now at the ground zero, I suppose, of that Protestant British identity. James was defeated in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, so it's the last great European battle fought on Irish soil. Irish history has been remarkably untouched. Ireland itself has been remarkably untouched by the sort of large-scale warfare or conflict that is the norm, or was the norm until quite recently in the European mainland. But what the new Protestant regime, new British Protestant regime does in Dublin is that it enacts a range of anti-Catholic legislation. Now this is, we talked yesterday about what does sectarianism look like? What's its impact? Well, this is like sectarianism taken to the nth degree. At one stage, the Protestant Parliament in Dublin was talking about legislation to castrate all Catholic priests. I mean, that's legislation in, sectarianism at its most crass and I suppose primal. So a series of laws are enacted to force the Irish basically to abandon Catholicism and to conform to the established church, to the Anglican church. So you have things like people are restrained from going abroad for an education, i.e. because the Irish were going abroad for a Catholic education. All Catholics were disarmed, so guns were taken from them. Monasteries, nunneries and so on, they're all banished, they're all closed down, clergy are banished. Catholics are prevented from becoming lawyers. Why? Why would you prevent a body of people from becoming lawyers? Well, access to the law empowers, quite simply, and once you're beyond access to the functions of the law, it means that you're severely disempowered. There you go. Priests were banished from Ireland. All priests who did remain, elderly and so on, were forced to register. So this ushers in the very high point of Anglo-Irish English control of Ireland. And during the course of the 18th century, they create a fabulous civilization, a fabulous material civilization. They build great houses, they beautified Dublin, they create a parliament, but it's a totally Protestant country, a small Protestant minority, an elite, and at the bottom of the social pile are Catholics. So it's a recipe, as you might imagine, for disaster if you keep the large majority of people out of power. Catholics they thrive as merchants because they're excluded from the professions. Towards the end of the 18th century, there is some loosening of these anti-Catholic laws. It's a period of great expansion for the British Empire. Whilst they lose the states that become the United States of America, British begin to turn eastwards, they begin to turn to India. So they begin to need a very large army, okay? And when you've got on your doorstep a population of Irish Catholics, you realize that you need to actually begin to recruit them into the British Army. So this is the beginning, and this is why I say it's difficult to call this purely colonial, because the Irish become very central to the whole British imperial project. So we need to be careful. It's not a question of being black or white. There are so many shades of grey here, which make this something of a minefield in making very definitive pronouncements. There are attempts to secure an independent Ireland, a group called the United Irishmen, who were non-sectarian, inspired by the French Revolution, inspired by notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They have strong support amongst Presbyterians. Presbyterians are if I could put it very bluntly, Presbyterians are a more left-wing, they're a more left-wing expression of Protestantism. I know that probably wouldn't satisfy theological experts amongst you, but just for as a working guide, Presbyterians, and they dominate the north of Ireland today. They're a more left-wing expression of Protestantism. So the failure of this rebellion in 1798 opens the way for the sort of sectarianism that we're familiar with today, and in particularly with a group called the Orange Order, which was founded in 1795, and who are still tremendously important. And, you know, in these days of identity politics, it's perhaps unfashionable to call out a particular group or organization for being sectarian. But for my money, I would think it would be safe to say that the Orange Order is a sectarian organization, which is very important today in parts of the north of Ireland, okay? It's a Masonic-style organization. It does not accept non-Protestants or women as members, or it does not accept Protestant men married to Catholic women. Now, for my money, I would call this sectarian. What do you think, Simon? Yeah, I mean, it's not an organization that I certainly would be joining. They probably wouldn't have me anyway. It's fine. And they are inextricably linked with political manifestation of identity even today, okay? And you find offshoots of this Orange Order in places like Glasgow, Liverpool. I've even seen, to my astonishment, an Orange Lodge, an Orange Order Lodge, an association was coming in a few years ago, landed at Melbourne and was coming into downtown. Was, wow, an Orange Lodge in Australia, was bizarre. So the immediate impact of this rebellion at the end of the 18th century was to convince Parliament in Westminster that they really needed to bring Ireland more closely within the ambit of the United Kingdom. Okay, so Ireland is annexed or whatever; it's incorporated within the Union. So it becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the Irish elect MPs. But Catholics don't have votes. They still don't have votes. So it's an integral part of the United Kingdom, but Catholics don't have, well, Catholics don't have votes anywhere in the United Kingdom, okay? Let's take it out of its Irish context. So they are disenfranchised. Naturally enough, a head of steam builds up. Catholic middle class wish to be represented, wish to elect their own MPs. And in this context, a figure called Daniel O'Connell emerges. He's called the Liberator. I don't want to go into any great detail here. Here he is. He builds up. He politicizes the Irish masses. He brings them all together, so he creates a uniquely potent force. He secures Catholic emancipation in 1829. Catholics can now sit in Parliament. He was also anxious to secure rights for excluded Jews. And that campaign that O'Connell initiated resulted in the Jews Relief Act of 1858. And bear in mind that, you know, in the 19th century, British identity is still very much, it's one of loyalty to the crown, focused on being a Protestant, ideally a member of the Church of England or an Anglican, but failing that, a Protestant or a Methodist. So it's still an identity which is not a comfortable identity for Irish Catholics. There is, I think, it would be fair to say, a strong level of sectarianism in England in the anti-Catholicism, to be more specific, well into the 19th century, and I think that manifests itself in the situation with the Crown today, where the Queen is the head of the Church, and as far as I know, it's still not legal for a member of the royal family to marry a Catholic. That's still the case, isn't it, Simon? It's not possible for a member of the royal family to marry a Catholic? It's possible now, is it? No, it's not possible. No.
I think it is.
Is it? But you can't ascend the throne, obviously, as, yeah.
The recent one, I don't remember his name, but the recent one who got married to someone who...
I think you need a dispensation. I mean, I don't think it's.
Yeah, there was a bit of an uproar that I paid no attention to. Sorry, I was a little distracted by an orange order lodge in Ghana.
Ghana, okay. I'm sure there must be in Nigeria then. I mean, it's just like the mind boggles. Why would you want to... The other thing that I find very amazing about Northern Ireland today, when you travel around Northern Ireland, they have adopted the symbolism of the Middle East. Why, I don't quite know. And Catholics identify with Palestinians, right? So in Catholic areas, they'll fly the Palestinian colours, and very strong links between extreme Irish nationalism and the Palestinians. And the Protestants fly the Israeli flag. They fly the Star of David. It's quite bizarre because they've got loads of their own flags. So why do they need? So it's like, okay, we've got our own conflict here, but let's adopt somebody else's conflict while we're at it, you know. So
I googled it. Meghan had to convert to the Church of England before she was allowed to.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm not trying to be troublesome today, but that is sectarian, isn't it? Yeah. So I think, you know, when Europeans look around and accuse others of being sectarian, I think maybe they need to look more closely at their own particular living room, right? Sectarianism is not something that, well, is seen as something that's, you know, well, it's still in the more backward parts of Europe and then elsewhere. No, I think it's much more deeply rooted, and we just don't recognize it. It's almost become, you know, monarchies are almost seen as like part of the heritage industry, but the heritage industry has its own level of ideological inflection, right? Anyway, to continue. So my point is that because of this colonial situation, colonial inverted commas, because I don't want to say, you know, that the Irish didn't benefit from incorporation. They did in many respects. And Ireland becomes an intensely modern country in the 19th century. Railways are built everywhere. There's an infrastructure built. So it becomes integrated within the UK. But what does happen is that there's a famine in the middle of the 19th century, 1845, 1849. 1 million Irish die. They feel that the English didn't react quickly enough, and it alienates. It serves as a profound basis for alienation. And the other thing is 1 million Irish migrate to America, where they become intensely troublesome. So you have a diaspora, and I think this is something that would, you know, resonate with people who are interested in the Middle East. We had a conversation yesterday, Nate, about Lebanon. And when people leave their home country with a sense of political or religious grievance, you're probably also storing up more trouble, okay? So you have this emergence of Irish Americans who feel a great sense of grievance that they've been forced out of their own country, they've had to go to America, where they make a go of things. They, in America, face a lot of prejudice from the Protestant establishment, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment. They overcome that. It's the typical American story, isn't it? You've got waves of people coming in, they face discrimination for whatever reason, they establish themselves, and then it's the next bunch who get it on the head. So, you know, after the Irish, it's the Poles. After the Poles, it's the Germans, and so on. So, you know, it's still happening today. It's the Latinos who are at the bottom of the food chain. So the Irish become intensely powerful in America, and that culminates with the election of an Irish Catholic, the only Catholic who has ever been elected a president. Now, talking about sectarianism again, right? I mean, like, it just leads. So we've only ever had, as far as I know, two Catholic candidates for the presidency in America, right? Al Smith, I think, in the 90s, I could be correct, Al Smith, and only one Catholic president, an Irish-American called John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, whom I'm sure I don't need to talk about. So the Irish have become intensely politicized. O'Connell has put them together. They then adhere to a very strict form of Catholicism. It becomes a badge of identity. There's this massive expansionism of a Catholic infrastructure. They control hospitals, they control schools, they're becoming more powerful, they start missions. The Irish use the British system to establish missions across the British imperial realm. So in a way, when I say again, I want to emphasize this, they're not exactly victims. They know how to exploit the autonomy that is available to them. And you have this just like anywhere you go in Ireland, you'll have these huge 19th century churches which are now empty. The So there's this militant scene, there's a sense of difference that culminates in 1916. I know I'm running out of time, so you have a rebellion in Dublin in the middle of the First World War. The British feel they've been stabbed in the back. They're fighting on two fronts now. There's a very vicious reaction. The leaders of the rebellion are executed. The majority of the Irish turn to a more militant form of nationalism. And it ushers in two different states, okay? Both states are sectarian. One is highly Catholic, the south of Ireland. The other is a Protestant state. The Irish Free State, which becomes the Irish Republic, has a constitution, 1937. It recognized the special position of the Catholic Church, but also recognized and guaranteed the rights of the Church of Ireland, the Protestants, Methodists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and the Jewish community, which is quite small in Ireland. Ireland moved away from the Commonwealth and becomes a very Catholic country. I mean, Catholicism isn't the state religion, but it might as well have been, all right? The churches have their own universities. Trinity College Dublin is a Protestant university. It's not possible. The Catholic Church in Ireland forbids Catholics to attend Trinity. It has a whole range of colleges of its own. They're technically secular, but in a country where 95% of the people are Catholic and strongly Catholic, you have a very religious society, a society of distinct religiosity, okay? There's a very strong Catholic religiosity. But things begin to change, and this is where I think it becomes interesting. By industrialization of the South begins in the 1960s. The Protestant Northeast had always been heavily industrialized. From the 19th century onwards, shipbuilding, linen, and so on, it was quite different to the south. And it fed into this myth, well, the south of Ireland is a very backward country, reliant on small farms, very Catholic. Look at the northeast of Ireland, it's Protestant, it has shipbuilding, it has industry, it's part of a larger empire, it's progressive, it's modern, it's where you want to be, as opposed to being stuck in the more backward southern part. But that paradigm now has been turned on its head. The South becomes industrialized in the 1960s. It joins the what was then the European Economic Community with our dear friends in the UK and Denmark in 1973. And I have to stop and pause to express my regret at the exit of the United Kingdom from the EU at the end of this month. I think it's going to impoverish all of us in Europe. So religion seems to have been very central to national identity in the Republic down to the 1970s, but that has changed. So the decline of the Catholic Church seems to be comparable to what happened in Quebec in the 1960s. Overnight, the Catholic Church in Quebec, Montreal, was extremely powerful, but it was also tied into a quasi-colonial situation. Catholicism was a badge, a marker of identity for French Canadians who felt threatened or dominated by an Anglo-Protestant elite in Canada. So I think the two are quite similar. So, and what I'm trying to say is that you use religion to mark your identity, to put you in an oppositional position. Well, I am not Protestant, therefore I'm not English. I am Catholic, therefore I am Irish. But when that need goes away, and I think the need began to go away in the 1960s, how do you identify yourself? Do you need religion anymore? And that's the question, and we're in the middle of this. I don't have any answers. It's a theory that material prosperity, an increased sense of confidence. Ireland is very committed to the European integration, rather. Britishness has changed quite dramatically. So does the need for a strong religious identity, which is generated by a variety of things, not just religious belief or dogma, does that begin to wane slightly, as was the case in Quebec? And in Quebec, I understand that the French language has emerged now as the primary marker of identity. Whatever the case, there is no doubt that Catholicism is on a downward curve in Ireland, and very markedly so. introduction of divorce, marriage equality by referendum, which is a total slap in the face for the Catholic Church, abortion, which is equivalent to a kick, I think, for the Catholic Church, given that it's so central in Catholic teaching, was introduced by popular mandate in 2018. Attendance at Mass has dropped dramatically, particularly in places like Dublin, to around 20%. They will run out of priests by 2030. Frankly, most young people aren't interested in religion. My students, when I was growing up, you would know if somebody was Catholic or Protestant. Now young people don't seem to care, and they don't pick up on the difference. And ironically, the fastest growing faith in Ireland is not a Christian denomination, it is Islam. In 1991, there were just under 4,000 Muslims in Ireland. Now there are over 100,000, and that's a very conservative guesstimate. And the churches are places of worship that are being built. Catholic churches that are being abandoned or demolished are mosques. So, how does a country which was so innately associated, or a society, with a specific religious form of expression, why or how does it move away from that? And what are the factors which drive that? And as I say, the Quebec-Ireland case is very instructive. My next lecture will be on the north of Ireland, which is quite different, where religion still acts as a marker, a deep-seated marker, almost a primal marker of identity, of being either British or Irish. I think I'll leave it there. I know I've thrown a lot at you, and you got this whistle-stop tour of the history of a small island in the Atlantic with an equally small population. But nonetheless, I think certain patterns here resonate with what I've heard over the past 2 days, and might give us food for thought as to, well, when do sectarian identities become less needed, less required? Okay? Because everything is, sectarian identities are there because they serve a function, don't they? Surely. They prop something up. And when they're no longer required, as seems to be the case in Ireland from the 1960s, what happens? Or what replaces religion as your identity? Is it language? Because the Irish don't speak Irish. That language began to decline. Where do alternative markers, and how do they develop? And I'd be very interested to see how Irish Muslims, how Islam is incorporated or is accommodated, or how it works within the Irish context. Okay, I have a number of young students who are Irish-born, but of Middle Eastern or Pakistani parentage, and I'm curious as to what their experience is, and how they will situate themselves in this sort of society. Thank you for listening to me.